That is one of the very important courses in the Institute of Chartered Accountant examination. This first section, we are going to look at the introductory aspect of the course to understand the basics and the foundation of the course. First and foremost, let's look at what business analysis is. But I would want to cite a nice scenario. Okay, there is a business that has started, and as an individual, you are being called upon to come and help to discuss the business so that the business can be accelerated. The point is, how are you going to contribute to the discussion? On what areas are you going to discuss the acceleration of the business? I want to draw your attention to three aspects when it comes to discussions of the business. The first thing is the position. It is important to understand the position of every business, especially when the business wants to strive or the business wants to accelerate or move to another level. The second thing that we are also going to is very important to talk about is choices. Choices. It is important to understand the various choices that are available to the organization when it comes to strategy. So that is to say that there are so many choices of strategies that organization can make. Is it okay? So the second level has to do with the fact that the organization or the discussion should be centered on the various strategies that are available to the organization. Then the last level has to do with the implementation. So once a choice is made, then there should be an implementation. So that is strategy into action. Strategy into action. So then when we talk about business analysis, that has to do with the identification or knowing the business position or the strategic position of the business and making strategic choices and putting those strategy into action. So now we're going to proceed to understand, since there is one thing that continues to repeat, that is strategies. It is important for us to know what strategy is. We are going to define strategies according to three authorities in strategic management. So the first one has to do with Chandler. So how did Chandler define strategy? Chandler mentioned that strategy is the determination of long-term goals and objectives and adoption of courses and allocation of resources in order to achieve the objectives. So Chandler is very concerned about determining long-term goals for the organization, determining long-term objectives for the organization, adopting some courses, is it okay? Then allocating resources that are available in order to achieve those long-term goals and objectives that has been set. Also, we'll talk about Peter Drucker. Peter Drucker mentioned that strategy is the pattern of activities that seeks to achieve objectives of the organization and adapt its scope and resources and operations to environmental change, okay, in the long term. So that is what pattern Peter Drucker mentioned. So with Peter Drucker, it has to do with what? Pattern of what? Activities, okay, that seeks to achieve the objective of organization, adapting the scope, resources, operations to a changing environment. Then we'll talk about the last definition by Johnson, Scholes, and Whittington. Johnson, Scholes, and Whittington. So Johnson, Scholes, and Whittington spoke about strategy as the direction and scope of an organization over a long term, okay, then which achieves advantage in a changing environment through the configuration or through its configuration of resources and competence with the aim of fulfilling stakeholders' expectation. Is it okay? So when it comes to Johnson, Scholes, and Whittington, Johnson, Scholes, and Whittington, they are considered to be authorities of when it comes to strategic management. So there is a need to emphasize on their definition. They spoke about the fact that stakeholders' expectation would have to be achieved. Is it okay? And they also spoke about the fact that there is a direction. Strategy is actually a direction and scope of the organization, and it's over a long-term period, and which achieves advantage in a changing environment. All right. So having understood what strategy is, it is important to talk about what strategic management is. We have to define what strategic management is. Strategic management is actually considered in three areas. The first aspect is identification, the second is selection, then the last is what? Implementation. So strategic management has to do with identification, selection, and implementation of strategies by an organization. Okay, that is for the achievement of the organization's long-term goals and objective. So we can go ahead to, when it comes to strategic management, there are other things to also talk about, other elements or things to talk about. We can mention we can mention strategic planning. We can talk about long-term planning. We can talk about corporate planning. But before we discuss this aspects of planning, the various aspects of planning, it is important to mention that strategic planning, management has three areas, and even that can be identified in the definition. We mentioned in the definition that strategic management is the identification, selection, and implementation of strategies. So that makes up the three elements of strategy or strategic management. That is the position, strategic position. Then the second is what? Strategic choices. Then the last one, which is the third, is the strategy into action. So the elements of strategic management is similar to the various elements of business analysis. Okay, so we are going to discuss that later in the courses or in the section. So, but we have to also look at what strategic planning is. Strategic planning has to do with formulating objectives for the organization and preparing a plan in order to achieve those objectives. So we can also go ahead to talk about long-term planning. When we talk about long-term planning, it's very similar to strategic planning, but long-term planning is very specific to individual units or individual departments in the organization, and mostly that is done on a short-term basis. Okay, so we can also talk about corporate planning. Corporate planning is also similar to strategic planning, but that is on a shorter base. It's on a shorter base. So we can go ahead. So now we are going to talk about the various levels of strategy. The various levels of strategy. So at the highest level, it's the corporate strategy. When we talk about corporate strategy, it has to do with the overall strategy of the organization. So what is the main or the overall strategy of the organization? That reflects the corporate strategy. And here we are looking at what the entity or the organization seeks to do as a business. Okay, so now let's talk about the corporate strategy and the things, the elements to look at for when it comes to the corporate strategy. We are looking at the purpose. One, the purpose of the organization. We are looking at two, the activities of the organization. Then we will also have to link or know the relationship between the activities and the resources that are available. Then the fourth one, we will also look at the purpose and the expectation of stakeholders. The purpose and activities, linking that towards the stakeholders' expectation. Then also we have to look at the linkage between the purpose and activities on one hand, and that of the other stakeholders' expectation on another hand. So that is it. So now let's go ahead to talk about the other level, the second level, that is business strategies. So business strategies. So business strategies are basically the strategies that enable the achievement of what? The corporate strategy. So anytime we talk about business strategies, we are talking about competitive strategies. So Porter mentioned that competitive strategies can be subdivided into two. Even though we have a third one, but the two main ones are the cost leadership and that of the differentiation. In the subsequent chapters, or the sections, we are going to delve into competitive strategy very well. But it's always important to understand that the business strategy is similar to that of competitive strategy, and the competitive strategy enables the achievement of the overall objective, that is the corporate strategy. Now let's move the third level, which is the functional strategy. So this has to do with the various functions in the organizations, and they are strategies that enable the achievement of the business strategy and that of the corporate strategy. Okay, all right, so at this point we are going to move from the levels of strategies and talk about the levels of planning. R.N. Anthony described 3 levels of planning. That is the strategic planning, that is overall planning of the organization. We also have the other level, which is the tactical planning. So that is planning on short-term base in order to achieve a medium-term objective. Then the third level is the operational planning, and that has to do with the day-to-day planning of the organization. Then we would have to also look at the approaches to planning. Now, if we want to sit and discuss planning, there is one simple question that will be asked. That is, which approach are we using? So there are 3 approaches to planning. 1 is rational planning. Then 2 is logical incremental. Then the last one is opportunity freewheeling. So now let's pick the first one and talk about that. So the first one is rational planning. So rational planning has to do with the former approach of planning, and that has to do with the top-down approach. So here the management or the top managers of the organization will plan, and that plan would be channeled down. Okay, would be channeled from the top to down. Is it okay? And that is what the rational planning. It is formal. Most organizations choose or adopt this aspect of planning or this approach of planning. Okay, and mostly it is done by what the manager, the top guys of the organization. Now, when we talk about logical incremental, with that, there is no formal plan, but then the strategies of the various units or the sub units of the organization, okay, will be considered to have a particular strategy. Is it okay? So typical example, an organization has finance unit, organization has the marketing, operations, HR. So all these units do have plans and do have strategies. So logical incremental has to do with having a strategy that emerges out of those various units. Is it okay? So at the end of the day, all the strategies and the plans adopted by the various units will have a particular plan that will submit out of those various planning and strategies. Okay, so let's go to the last approach, which has to do with opportunity freewheeling. With this approach, there is no strategy, there is no plan for the organization. They are only there to tap into any opportunity that is available. Okay, so with this approach, the organization would have no plan or no strategy put in place, but will make themselves available to tap into any other opportunity. So for instance, the organization will have a core line of business, but then it's open to so many opportunities. So once they identify that this area there is an opportunity, then they will gear towards that, putting their resources to achieve those opportunities that have been identified. So basically, that is it. These are the 3 approaches of planning. So I'm going to end by talking about the various elements of strategic planning, strategic management, and which is the same as the various elements of business analysis. So as I mentioned earlier, they are in three folds, they are in three parts. The first is strategic position, the second is choices, and the third is what? Implementation. So when you talk about the position, is like I mentioned earlier, it is important to understand the position of the business. So here there are three areas that we will look at. We'll talk about the strategic position, we'll talk about the strategic capabilities of the firm, that is the second. Then we'll talk about purpose and expectation. So once we discuss these three things, we'll be able to touch on every aspect of business position or strategic position. Then we look at the second aspect. So the second aspect has to do with strategic choices. Strategic choices. So that can also be segregated in some parts. So we can talk about the corporate choices or corporate strategies. We can talk about the business strategies, and the other aspect is what? The directions. So direction, we can talk about how the business will grow and all that. So looking at this, that specifically has to do with the various choices that are available to the organization. Then the last element has to do with the implementation, that is strategy into action. So here we are going to look at the organization of the various strategies, then enabling of the strategies, then change management of the strategies. Once the strategies are implemented, there is a need for management of change. So basically, that is the introductory aspect of the strategic case study, and with the subsequent videos, we'll talk in details about what strategic case is